What do fish and monsoon winds, nutmeg, the law of the sea, and a merciful goddess have in common? And add to that shipwrecks and ancient tombstones, pepper, and pearls. You are correct if you have guessed that each and all of these are often invoked and fought over as part of conversations about maritime heritage. How is it that so many different stories, objects, laws, ideas, and traditions can be thought of as maritime heritage? And who decides what is heritage?
I think that heritage is very much at the core of what identity is. It explains why we look a certain way, why we do certain things a certain way. It explains the language that we speak. It explains the kinds of traditions and tastes that we have, the food that we like. So yes, I do think that this question of what heritage is inextricable from the question of identity.
In this episode, the first in a two-part series on maritime heritage in Asia, we share some stories and voices associated with maritime heritage. While speaking to different experts and community members, we discovered that the histories, views, memories, and ideas associated with maritime heritage are as vast and diverse as the maritime world itself. Some speak of shipwrecks, others of food or religion, and yet others think of heritage communities, symbols, practices, and oral histories.
The idea here is maritime heritage getting us to look not just at the land, but the water, right? A more comprehensive view of the environment that we inhabit, the planet that we inhabit is really important. And I think that because now, before the digital revolution, before the jet revolution, and before the steam revolution, we had this sail-based maritime culture, right? It was a very different way of imagining space, imagining time, and imagining interactions between different types of human beings. And I think that one important thing this heritage can do is to give us access to pictures of radically different ways the world once was, to help us see a broader range of possibilities about how the future might go for us.
Maritime does not mean only shipwrecks. Maritime means society's viewpoints, the communities, their involvement with the sea, but more importantly, how did the sea impact people? And in what ways did it impact people? And I think the emphasis so far in a lot of maritime history, particularly of the early modern or the ancient and the pre-modern period, has been on trade. Maritime is much more than just trade and just economic activity.
I'm born in Japan, surrounded by sea, 360 degrees. So we are islander as well. But then, I never really pay attention. We have people like Okinawa and Ryukyu people. It's really like they are islander. I'm sure they have much more strong maritime identities. But we kind of disregard those Ainu culture, Ryukyu cultures for a long time, and then people just incorporate it into the central government system. So then those cultures wasn't really respected. So those attitudes, everything really reflect on how we interpreted maritime heritage and identity.
A state or a tribe or a family comes from the top down. The patriarch of the family, the ministers, that's top down. They decide this is what should be remembered about our community. But what about the members of the family or the community at the bottom there? Do they passively accept that this is what should be remembered? Or is there a resistance, a negotiation, a tussle between what they feel about the directives, the ideas of the top, and counter by saying, no, this is how we remember ourselves in the community.
When we say about maritime heritage, it could be anything. Some people would say food is maritime heritage because I eat fish, it's connected with water and so on. But to some people, it's more emotional. Probably it's because they have the tradition of like cloth making, dress making, because it's passed from their grandmothers and it's very personal. So different perspective on heritage. What I learned from the community is how they put meaning, they give meaning into this object, or maybe it's not an object even. Like if we say it's a heritage, warisan, it's pusaka, then if you lose it, you're losing your sense of identity, you're losing your sense of dignity. But there's also heritage that has different layer in that. It's tangible. If you need it, you can give it away. It's still our heritage. But those kind of understanding, I found many in the communities, and it's not a single perception.
I would say, for some communities, like the Gujarati communities, they have a very maritime community, right? Even before the coming of the British that I mentioned, and they have continued that, right? So they do understand this maritime issues. There are some very small communities, cultural manifestations through practices and rituals which are pretty sort of requires this maritime, like riverine and the maritime, and so this kind of exercises like floating the boat in the water on a certain day, or looking at the sea, going to the sea and worshipping it for certain reasons, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say maritime is completely out of their vision or their idea, but for many it just came sort of as a part of their conditioning and not essentially they're thinking that it is a maritime. So this happens, he's gone to earn money and he comes back. So is it the maritime which is helping me or not? I believe that's not that they are focused in their thinking about, right? So that is one. Historically, in a present sense, with the kind of communication links that we find, I don't think people even think about whether it's maritime, airborne, riverine, anything, land. Everybody's flying, right?
The allure and mystery, danger and promise of the sea means that from ancient times, people's associations with the maritime world also involved many celestial and supernatural beings. Heritage, in this context, comes with the stories and rituals meant to appease and express gratitude towards those who have unyielding power to interfere with human plans and destinies. Over many centuries and until today, one of the greatest protectors for Chinese seafarers has been the sea goddess Mazu. Temples dedicated to Mazu stretch from Fujian through the Indonesian archipelago and all the way to South Africa. Mazu is the heavenly embodiment of Lin Monyang, a shamaness from a small fishing village, once situated in the Fujian province. Inscriptions record Lady Lin as being able to foretell a man's good and ill luck, and her ability to predict the weather and sea conditions. The background processions here show Mazu's birthday celebrations in Singapore, which took place even during the COVID pandemic, with Mazu's explicit approval. What the story of Mazu suggests is that at the level of communities, heritage invariably reflects an interconnected history of shared traditions, beliefs, and customs. An idea very different from how nation-states today try to use heritage in order to streamline a notion of national identity. A similar flux of identities, cultures, and practices are captured in the rituals and traditions in Kalimantan, Indonesia. In the area of Singkawan, or what to the Hakka community was known as...
It's called Shangkoyang, the town below the mountains on the mouth of the oceans. I just visited there a couple of weeks ago for their festival of the first full moon of the lunar year. On that day, about 1,000 spirit medium troops, or spirit mediums sitting on sedan chairs made out of knives and nails, are carried through the streets. And about half of them are Dayak community, so wearing big kingfisher headdresses and feathers and adorned with skulls. About half of the Dayaks turn out to be Chinese dressed up as Dayaks because they can learn the spirit possession traditions more readily from the Dayak masters than in the Chinese temples, which have more hereditary systems. On Fridays, during Islamic prayers, suddenly the procession has to go silent because most of the time there's gongs and drums or gamelan for some of the Dayak troops, and quite a sensational amount of noise. But during those times it's completely quiet and they just glide through the streets like ghosts. So it's a seaside city that was originally the place where all the gold from the gold mines in the mountains above Singkawang used to come down. The Hakkas got there in the 1750s. They built an independent kingdom outside of China that lasted for 100 years.
You can see how the story of Singkawan is not part of a national heritage, although the practices and traditions of the community are central to the local sense of identity. The ingenious combination of local identity and sense of heritage and tradition are also visible in communities' symbolic representations. Consider, for example, the unusual seal of Salem, Massachusetts. Yes, this is the Salem of witches, but in fact,
the city flag of the city of Salem has a guy standing on the beach wearing a sarong and a really funny hat under a palm tree with a big Salem ship out in the roads. And it's the legend of the city flag of Salem describes this as, quote unquote, a native of Achin, welcoming a Salem merchant vessel into port. British trading ports were closed to the Americans for understandable reasons. And so we had to go find our own sources of pepper. So we could no longer, for example, go and buy pepper from Malabar. And so you began enterprising Salem merchants trying to find places where they could trade without going to British ports and without having to pay Dutch taxes. So the west coast of Sumatra, because it was part of the sovereign sultanate of Aceh, but as Aceh weakened in the 18th century into the early 19th century, those ports were under only very nominal Achenese control. And so a bunch of local Chinese and Tamil traders had set up there, and they were the ones doing business with the Salem merchants. So it was sort of under the radar for both the British and the Dutch, and it's allowed the Americans a kind of niche market for a brief period in the mid-19th century.
The stories and practices of local communities, even when not part of the official national heritage, are a reminder of something else. That throughout history, people, especially close to the sea, would always see themselves as part of a bigger universe, and that there were calamities and circumstances beyond human control. This was especially the case for those who would travel across the seas.
The ocean is regularly referred to as the world's largest museum. And so if you're interested in heritage and not looking at the ocean, you're missing like 70% of the story. UNESCO is responsible for the 2001 Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. There's a sentence on that website that says that there are estimated to be 3 million ancient shipwrecks in the world. And so that doesn't even account for the modern and contemporary shipwrecks. Like, there's a lot of heritage in the ocean.
When discovered, the shipwrecks and their contents can bring in trove of new information about the past and allow us to understand interactions and connections across the maritime world in a new and very exciting ways. Consider, for example, the discovery of an Arab town close to the Indonesian island Belitung. Today, the contents of the shipwreck are on display at the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore.
In Southeast Asia, this was a big theatre of war during World War II, and there are about 2,000 World War II shipwrecks in Southeast Asia. While I was working on the Belitung shipwreck and undertaking research on that particular shipwreck, which was wrecked in what would become Indonesian territorial waters in the 9th century, I became aware of other issues that were emerging in the management of underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia, in particular the salvage of World War II shipwrecks from Indonesian waters. And this came about when the Dutch were seeking to do a survey in advance of a significant anniversary of the loss of these shipwrecks, and they went to the sites and they dived, and there was nothing on the seabed. The wrecks had been completely removed. And so this has happened to Dutch wrecks in Indonesia. It's also been happening to an Australian shipwreck, HMAS Perth, which was also lost in World War II with the loss of 353 men. And that went down at the same time as USS Houston, which is nearby, which has also been subjected to illicit salvaging for scrap metal.
Whereas the shipwreck stuff really only started around the early 90s. There were licensing mechanisms to go in there and officially excavate. There was wording within the legislation which insisted on archaeological supervision, but there was absolutely no enforcing of that. So companies that went out would do it of their own volition or not do it at all, and there was no repercussion to that. But yeah, over the years, there's been more and more material discovered that went through till about 2010. They were still working with commercial outfits. And then there's a moratorium put in place in 2010. So a lot, including big backers of the UNESCO Convention, would say that's a wonderful thing, that now the wrecks are being saved from commercial exploitation. But the flip side was that everything was then left. They didn't have their own capacity to go out there, not even looking for stuff, but just to follow up on things that were inadvertently found by fishermen. And in the past, fishermen had started looting. Sometimes they were caught, sometimes they sold the position. Personally, I got information from fishermen and employed them all as my divers and doing all the logistics, and they were fantastic. But that's no longer an option for the fishermen, and they bring up one plate which can feed their family for months. So they've got so much incentive to carry on. They're working out of a small fishing boat, which is almost impossible to detect. So the looting went up, exponentially since that moratorium came into place, and we know nothing apart from you might go and walk down Jalan Surabaya and go past an antique shop and see ceramics with coral, then a new wreck's been found. But that's all you know. And then you don't know which one that's come from, and other stuff is mixed with it, so all the context is gone. All the information, we never know what sort of a ship it was.
You can see how, for many, conversations about heritage are indelible from conversations about shipwrecks. But while the primary focus had been on the content of the shipwrecks and what it can tell us about the past, there is yet another way in which shipwrecks are directly linked to heritage. They are located on the ocean floor, which has been recognized as the common heritage of humankind as part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Yet, today, the ocean floor is facing utter devastation from trawlers casting their nets. The latest convention on the high seas can hopefully have an effect on such practices, preserving the heritage of the sea and the memories of the past. These examples only scratch the surface of the different ways people conceive of the past and of maritime heritage. They also reveal the intense, dynamic, and constantly evolving universe of memories, practices, traditions, and objects which can constitute heritage. But do they? And who is to say what constitutes heritage?
it's a process where communities, I would say, come to understand themselves in the context of others. So it's a process where I think it's interesting, where people who do not know about history try to search for history and use selectively part of the history to create their own identity. So I think it's a complex process, and I think that also applies to states that do it, but it's also for communities as well. So heritage making is not just an activity of a state, but also especially overseas communities that move around. They have lost their histories and they try to find their histories as part of identity making.
These questions are important because they inform understandings of identity and values, ranks and prestige in the international system. In the words of a scholar,
heritage produces something new, which takes recourse to the past, which means heritage is a process it's more about heritageization and putting valorization of these many events and things of the past, of some of them.
Taking the question of heritageization seriously, in the next episode, we will add yet another layer to the heritage problematic, the digitization of heritage. While much celebrated and endorsed by many, perhaps there are some aspects of the practice that require further thought. We invite you to explore this topic with us in the next episode.